Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is the most crowded I've ever seen a Sailor Series, so congratulations to all of you for selling out Sailor Series. This is the hottest ticket in town. People are still coming in. There's still some seats down front. There's still some seats around, and there's a few over there. So welcome. Come on in. I am Sarah Budlong. I'm Director of Development here at the Whaling Museum, and I'm thrilled to introduce tonight. We are honored to host a Voyage to the Arctic with Captain Graham McKay. Graham, as you all know, because you've bought tickets to come tonight, is the master boat builder and director of Lowell's Boat Shop, which is a phenomenal organization doing wonderful work that we have sort of long admired. In a few minutes, you will travel with Graham aboard the historic schooner Bowdoin, exploring its storied past in its most recent voyages to the ice-choked waters of Greenland and the Arctic Circle, which has been in the news a lot lately, so it's a very timely talk tonight. This is a gripping story. I'm glad you're all here tonight to hear it. This program was really the brainchild of our membership coordinator, Jillian, who grew up in Amesbury. So thank you, Jillian, for the idea for this inspired evening. And speaking of membership, if you are here tonight and you are not a member of this museum, we would love you to join so you can continue to get updates from us and get discounts on programming. Tonight is supported by Ruth and Hope Atkinson and by the Samuel D. Rositsky Lecture Fund. This evening is also sponsored by Babbitt Chainwheel, previously Babbitt Steam, a longtime friend who has supported this series for a number of years. Thank you to our sponsors. We couldn't do it without you. And where is he? Without further ado, I'm ready to bring our speaker up. Graham, we are so crowded, I don't see you. Where are you? There he is. Here he comes.
I think I'm on this one. Great. All right. Thank you. We're on. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out. I'm fighting a little bit of a cold, so bear with me there. This is great. Who would have thought? I'm Graham McKay. Thank you guys for supporting a place like the New Bedford Whaling Museum. It means I also run a museum up in Amesbury, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. But it's great to see such a turnout for a museum these days, and it does mean a lot to the community at large. And I think people who aren't necessarily part of a museum see them as a repository for old dusty stuff. And what it really is a community, and that provides community service like this. So I'm glad that you guys are all here to see me and hear about a voyage to the Arctic on the schooner Bowdoin. And thank you to our sponsors. Yeah. This is usually the slide that I start with. So we'll talk about this boat, and we'll talk about this voyage, which I have to say, I was an employee of Maine Maritime Academy when we did this voyage, and the ship is owned by Maine Maritime Academy and is the state ship of Maine, which I didn't know until this summer. And I also have to thank my employer, Lowell's Boat Shop, for giving me 2.5 months off to go do this trip. And I am used to doing these talks in a room that knows me very well, so this is nice to see very few faces, actually, that I know in this room. So I have to tell you who I am. I am Graham McKay. I'm the executive director at Lowell's Boat Shop in Amesbury. We are the oldest operating boat shop in America. It was a dory factory, basically. They made fishing dories. If you guys are from New Bedford, you know the Ernestina Morrissey. We would have made the dories that went on the Ernestina Morrissey. So nowadays, Lowell's Boat Shop is a working museum where you can come visit us just like you can come visit the Whaling Museum. It's also a working part, so we still make dories and boats, and might perhaps make a whaleboat for the city of New Bedford. I'm also a tall ship captain. So sailing tall ships my whole life, that's how I know New Bedford, that's how I know Ernestina. I spent a lot of time here, mostly over at Fairhaven Shipyard. And I'm a maritime archaeologist. So I have a master's in maritime history and archaeology from the University of Bristol. And so in addition to all my other things, I sit on the state board now that oversees underwater archaeological resources in Massachusetts. So if you find something underwater in Massachusetts, you got to come see us to get a permit to go look at it, basically. And I just finished this book. This is out new this year. If you like, this is a shameless plug. These will be available after the talk in our little cocktail hour for anyone who wants one. But basically, this is a project here. I'm a boat builder by trade. Went to Nova Scotia to build a boat with this gentleman who is the last of his line, building these dories up in Shelburne. So did that project with him, recorded it for posterity, and now it's available as a book. All right, so that's me. Get that out of the way. My bona fides, if you want to call it that. So why is the Bowdoin special? The story of the Bowdoin starts really with Admiral Perry when he made his famous trip to the North Pole in 1909. And the story of the Bowdoin is really the story of Don McMillan. And Don McMillan here was with Perry on that expedition to the pole in 1909. McMillan didn't make the last leg because he had a busted leg, I guess. But here they are, supposedly reaching the North Pole, and there's a little bit of a question mark as to whether they actually reached the pole even to this day. But he is accepted as having been the first one to reach the pole. What happened was McMillan, who was just a young teacher recently out of Bowdoin College, he sort of caught the bug, the Arctic bug, and decided to make it his life's work. So he raised some money, and he had built the Bowdoin, which was the schooner that I took to Greenland. She was launched in 1921 in April in East Booth Bay, Maine. Hodgson Brothers is still there. They recently sold their waterfront property, but you can still buy a boat from the Hodgson Brothers. And anyone who's a mariner knows it's pretty inadvisable to take your brand new boat and freeze it into the ice in the Arctic, but that's what McMillan did. So launched in April, and by November, he was frozen in here in Baffin Island up in the Arctic. And he did this several times over the course of the ship's life and his own life. And this was a fairly typical situation. You can see here, they built igloos over the hatchways and then surrounded the ship with snow to basically keep it warm. Built an igloo around the boat itself. Now I've done it. All right, thanks for coming, everybody. Oh, wait, look, we're back. All right, look ahead. Great. So McMillan made 26 Arctic voyages from 1921 to 1954. And if you think about that time period, the Arctic, 1909, no one had reached the pole. It went from that to being fairly well traveled. A lot of technological advances took place during this time. Even, I think, Byrd flew to the North Pole in an airplane during this period. So it went from a place that nobody had been to a place that still very few people had been to, but it became much more accessible. And McMillan kept going up there, he made a lot of friends among the native peoples, and they actually helped him winter over. So a lot of the earlier expeditions failed because they didn't learn from the native peoples of the Arctic how to eat, how to live in the harsh environment, and McMillan did do that. But up here you can see, fairly typical. Everyone's got a gun. You got polar bears to watch out for, but also they were up there doing a lot of scientific work, a lot of naturalizing, if you want to call it that. They shot a lot of stuff and brought it home. And if you happen to be driving up through Brunswick, Maine, the college, Bowdoin College, has put together a great Arctic museum. They just built a new facility for it. It wouldn't take you very long to go through it, but it's a great place to visit. And the Arctic was also uncharted. So Macmillan was a pretty brave guy, not only to take a ship to a harsh climate, but also in waters where there really weren't any charts. But a lot of what he was doing was creating charts, surveying, all of these things. He was on for a lot of this time, he was on National Geographic money, so the magazine was paying for a lot of these expeditions. If you look through the National Geographics from this period, you see about 5 or 6 articles about Macmillan up in the north. And that's what he was doing. But she was a well-built ship. She could take this kind of thing. She's only 88 feet long on deck, which for a knockabout schooner is not that long. But she's built like a schooner twice her length. So the scantlings, all the wood that's in her is sizable for her short little length. What he also had, when we talk about technological advances, he had radio antennas way up on the mast, so he could actually broadcast back to the States, and he was on the radio during this period. You had national radio broadcasts. They would call Macmillan in the Arctic when he was on a ship, and that would be broadcast throughout the nation. So he had a degree of fame at the time. World War II, the ship was purchased by the Navy. A lot of boats like this were used for coastal defense, coastal reconnaissance, that kind of thing. This was an Arctic boat, and they actually kept going to the Arctic. So she was under the command of a guy named Stu Hotchkiss. She kept going up to Greenland, and the Arctic did a lot of surveying, and some of the airfields, the military bases that are still in Greenland now, were surveyed during World War II by the Bowdoin. Came back, Macmillan bought her back. She was in a little tough shape after World War II. Got her fixed up, and he kept going to the Arctic about 10, 15 more years. And this time he was bringing students. And so, again, there was quite a bit of activity during World War II up there. You wouldn't think so, but there was. And sort of opened Greenland up to the world. Before that, Greenland was pretty closed off to the outside world, and we can talk about that during Q&A time. But what happened here, that opened up, and he started bringing students up. So the way to pay for those trips now, there wasn't a lot of money from National Geographic. He was getting students to pay to go along, and they would spend the summers, head up to Greenland for a couple months, come back. Ooh, Mystic Seaport, I almost missed that part. Anybody know when the Morgan went to Mystic? What year? 1959. Was it really? So, I'm asking because I don't know. But I assume it was about this time. So Mystic was just starting to get going. The Bowdoin was falling on tough times. The boat got donated to Mystic by Don and Miriam here. Clearly the Morgan was there because she's in the background. But the museum didn't really have the funds to keep the ship up. And it takes a lot of money to keep up a boat like this. She kind of sat at the dock for a bit, started to fall apart, at least as far as these ships do. And then, if you read and believe Jim Sharp's book, does anyone know Jim Sharp? He's spent most of his life at sea, which means he's a good storyteller. So, as Jim tells it, he and a bunch of guys from Maine got in a car and drove down to Mystic and stole the Bowdoin back, basically. Brought her back to Maine, fixed her up, and got her sailing again. And then he owned her for a bit. She bounced around Maine, and I love this photo. I actually, to be honest, I stole this off of Jim's Facebook. But it's really hard to get a picture of a ship, true picture of a ship in heavy seas, and really get an idea of what that looks like. And you can tell that she's a real able vessel from this. She's in a pretty big seaway, and she doesn't look like she's struggling at all. So Jim saved her. She bounced around Maine for a bit, and then finally ended up at Maine Maritime Academy, where she serves as a training ship. and this was the first part of our voyage. This is actually where it started. So Maine Maritime Academy, like most of these maritime academies, trains students to be merchant mariners. This trip that we went on this summer was a student trip to get sea time for these maritime school students so they could achieve their license. It started here in a yard period, so we hauled out in Belfast, got the boat all fixed up and ready, because you don't go to a place like the Arctic without doing a little bit of maintenance first and making sure all your I's are dotted and your T's are crossed. And this is departure day here from Booth Bay, Maine. When the ship goes to the Arctic, they always leave from Booth Bay. McMillan always did. Even though he lived most of his life in Provincetown, they would always leave from Booth Bay. The ship was built in Booth Bay, so to keep that tradition alive, we went from Castine down to Booth Bay and then started to head north. First part of our trip was Castine to St. John's, Newfoundland, and it was the roughest part of the trip. And a lot of these kids hadn't been to sea before. This guy's one of them. And for your first time out, I remember leaving Booth Bay and looking out at the outer islands, and you could see the waves, making whitewater around the islands, and I was like, uh-oh. And we got out there, and it was like this for about 8 days getting to St. John's. It was either like that, or it was like this. So it was the summer of fog when you head up. Coleridge had it right when he said the land of mist and snow, and this is exactly what it was. So when you get to the Grand Bank, so we're headed around here up to St. John's, you get the cold Labrador current meeting the Gulf Stream right where the bottom humps up, and when they mix together, you get fog and terrible seas. You also get a lot of marine life. You get a lot of fish. This is where your Ernestina Morrissey would have been out fishing in our dories. But it makes for a pretty uncomfortable time at sea. And this was a familiar view right here from the deck of the ship. So a quick stop in St. John's, basically to get fuel, to get provisions, and wait for a weather window to get across the Davis Strait. And the Davis Strait separates Labrador and Greenland. But what happens here is you start to see ice. So the currents, you can see, this is what keeps Greenland cold, is this cold current that basically is a necklace around the entire landmass. And Iceland is quite a temperate place to be because of these nice warm water currents. But what happens is the west coast of Greenland will shed these icebergs. They'll travel up around the top of the Davis Strait and then back down Baffin Island, the Labrador coast, and finally end up off of Newfoundland. Newfoundland's trying to push ice tourism pretty big right now, and that's basically where the icebergs end up after about 3 years of drifting up and back until they hit that warm current and melt. But over here, this is a typical ice chart, actually the ice chart from when we were in the area. And all of these are basically grids, a grid of 1 degree by 1 degree, and those are the number of big icebergs in that grid square. So you can see they kind of collect down here, and then they hit pretty hard. They collect right there as well off of the coast of Labrador. You get pretty excited when you see your first iceberg. I did. This was off the coast of Labrador, and there was the captain put a bounty of a case of beer on for the first person who saw an iceberg. It happened to be me, and I'm collecting it one at a time from him. And I should say that I was not the captain on this trip, though I do captain these vessels. Maine Maritime has a full-time captain and mate. And so I was actually a lowly third mate, which was a step down for me. But it was my only opportunity to go on this trip, and so I wasn't going to not take it. But I took these photos. I came prepared for the trip with a drone. I came unprepared with just my iPhone camera. So I took these photos through a pair of binoculars of the first ice that we saw, thinking, oh, I'm never going to see another piece of ice like this. I was quite wrong. What I was really excited to see was the Northern Lights. And I finally saw them last October in the local soccer field. You can see the soccer goal there. And the reason was this was the last sunset that we saw for a month on the left. So I'm like, Northern Lights, Northern Lights. And then I'm like, oh, well, if it's not dark, then you're not going to see any Northern Lights. So we were racing for the Arctic Circle for June 21st, which is the summer solstice, meaning we're not going to see darkness for a very long time. And the Davis Strait, I was like, oh, this is going to be, you know, like Cape Horn. You're going to see crazy seas. It's going to be cold and miserable. It was cold and miserable, but it was also flat like a mill pond. I don't know if we hit it just right, but apparently the ice cap of Greenland creates a pretty consistent high-pressure system over Greenland, and the weather in the Davis Strait, it's either docile or it's really terrible. And in our case, we found the window of 10 days of pretty docile. Most of this was a motorboat ride. And because we're at a whaling museum, we can't not talk about marine debris. Right in the middle of the whole thing, we came across this fishing net floating around. I just, drove by it one day and saw it there. We turned around and picked it up. But that's, hundreds of miles from shore, just, floating in the middle of nowhere. And if it were nighttime, if you were out in your fishing boat at nighttime and you ran that over, it got tangled in your wheel, you'd be, out there for weeks. Here on the right, we've got our first look at Greenland. So when you're going along, you've got your chart plotter, and it says, oh, you've got, 800 miles to go. And you're like, and you wake up every day, and it's like, hey, you've 725 miles to go, and you're just like, oh, damn it. And then finally, you wake up one morning, and Greenland's right there off the starboard bow. And it looks like that. We're 40 miles offshore there, and those are 5,000-foot peaks. And the air is crisp as can be when it's not foggy. We arrived in Nook. So it's interesting in that I gave some semblance of this talk 3 months ago, and no one had ever heard of Nook. And now most people have seen it on the news. And I can't imagine what the folks there are thinking, but it was not at all what I would have expected showing up to Greenland. I expected, red houses with white trim, very Nordic looking. Nook surprised me, and you have these high rises, these very Scandinavian looking buildings. And the reason is, in the 50s, the Danish government moved everybody from these outpost towns into population centers. It was easier to give them the social programs, things like that. And it was really hard to service the people who were in these super, super remote places. And they started to build these high rises. They're also easy to heat. The interesting part is, materials, all that, it all comes from outside. And so you'll be walking around and you'll see this nice new building going up, but behind it is the old one that they've condemned, but they don't knock it down, they just leave it there because it costs money to knock it down, it costs money to get rid of all the stuff. So you have these beautiful new buildings next to these old bombed out structures that are just standing there. But there are only 57,000 people in all of Greenland, 57,000 inhabitants. Does anyone know what the population of New Bedford is? What is it? 95,000 people in New Bedford. So more people in this city than in all of Greenland. So when you talk about, invading Greenland, you can do it with a couple of motorboats, and there aren't a lot of people there to beat you back. I did meet this gentleman when I was walking down the street in Nook, and this is Bjork. And Bjork picked me up on a rainy, miserable day. But I started to ask him all the questions. It was really hard. There was a language barrier for one, but I tried to ask questions of the locals whenever I could. And this guy was willing to talk to me for a while, and then I asked him about what he has seen as effects of climate change. And for him, he's about my age, he said. Growing up when he was, 15, 16, it would snow in October, couple 6-8 inches, and that snow would remain throughout the entire winter until the following May and just get built upon and built upon. Now he says through December, they'll get 4 or 5 inches of snow and then rain on top. It'll go away. He says they don't get appreciable snow maybe until end of January, and then the local ski slope won't open until probably February. And the harbor never freezes over anymore, and he, it's dark in the winter there all the time, so things kind of shut down, but he said that it's nothing like it used to be. Away we went from Nuuk up to Ilulissat. Now, Ilulissat is sort of the ice capital of Greenland. I think it's also what Greenland is trying to push as a, we're doing this again, as a tourist center. So during this part of the voyage, we did cross the Arctic Circle. For those of you unacquainted with it, the Arctic Circle is at 66 north, 66 and change. But what it is, it's the over-under line, where if you're above the Arctic Circle on the solstice, the sun never sets, or on the summer solstice, on the winter solstice, the sun never rises. So that's kind of the cutoff line. Here, we're traveling from Nuuk up to Ilulissat, and we crossed that line. At that point, we became blue nosers, and Macmillan used to do this. You painted the nose of the ship blue. We also had a little ceremony, but there were no cameras involved, so for good reason. But it involves soaking yourself in the Arctic Sea, which I can tell you is as cold as it's reported to be. And when you look at the map, the coast of Greenland is Disco Island, Disco Bay, cuts in and gets close to the ice cap of Greenland, and there are a number of fjords that are dumping ice into that bay on a consistent basis, and so it's known as the ice capital of the world. So that long-distance photo that I showed you of an iceberg, that was not necessary here. We came into Ilulissat. Where we had to go was over there, and nothing but ice in between us and where we were going. And it's gorgeous. It is, if anything took my breath away on this trip, it is the beauty of these chunks of ice. Every one is a sculpture, and I have 1,000 photos to prove it. But it's everywhere. This is the radar screen, and God help you to find a way through, and that's just the big stuff. The little stuff doesn't show up. So we had 6 miles of this and that. And you can see, too, you get some fog at the same time. So you can't see more than 2 boat lengths away, and you have to pick a lane, go between 2 icebergs, and then you got to figure out where your next one is. And it was, 6 miles of going maybe half a knot trying to get there. And then there we finally got, this was taken from a webcam, I think, actually. Somebody took this, but I'm up there. Giving directions. But this is when the fog finally lifted. You can see all the fog there. We came through all that to finally get to Ilulissat at probably 10 o'clock at night right here. Ilulissat, if anyone's outdoorsy, I would highly recommend it as a destination. And again, we're in the Arctic. We're 1,000 miles from home, but you can fly there. Mrs. Vance just did, I think. But you have to fly through, unless you can go to a military base, you have to fly through Iceland, and then you take a twin-engine prop plane from Iceland over to Greenland, which must be a pretty cool trip. I'd love to do that because you fly over the ice cap of Greenland. But very few people in this town. We're there during the height of summer. So this is June 22nd. 24-hour daylight. And when I said that this is where they're trying to promote tourism, they've built this Ice Fjord Center, one of the most beautiful buildings I've ever seen. And behind it is that fjord, and that fjord is producing the majority of these icebergs that you're seeing. And so there's a 10-kilometer trail out there along the fjord. I did it at midnight before we left in broad daylight. But all around you can see the evidence of winter, in the long, long winter. So there are roads, there are cars, but the roads go a mile in every direction and just stop. So you can't, you might have a 30-year-old car with 4,000 miles on it. And most of the year, when it does snow, because, if you think about Nook, where I was earlier, we're another 150 miles north. The main mode of transportation is dog sled. So there's a section of town in all of these towns called Dogland. Everyone has their dog teams out there, not in town. And these dogs are fairly aggressive. They're brought up to pull sleds, and that's about it. You don't want to pet them. And they spend their summer living on the ledge, each with a little house, most of them with a 10-foot chain. If there's any grass, you can see a stake in a 10-foot watch circle, and that's where the dog lives. People go up there once a day, throw them scraps of whatever they, scraps of caribou, scraps of seal, whatever they have hunted to keep the dogs going. But by the time the snow starts to fall, the dogs are pretty ready to run. They're excited to get off of that chain. But most houses have a dog sled in the yard. This is on the street, so the cars know it's dog sled crossing. I don't know if they even plow in the winter or if they even treat the roads at all. I think they just take to the dog sleds and leave the cars. So this was when we were in proper Greenland. So we spent about 10 days cruising around in the fjords of Disco Bay, maybe. Basically looking at ice, going on hikes in super remote places. And every day looks like this, every night looks like this. Big, huge mountains, big, huge icebergs. This is an old fishing outpost. The hard part was encouraging the captain to stop so I could launch the drone and actually get some good photos. It's very hard to launch and retrieve a drone from a moving ship. But when we did, it did pay off. And some of this was playing ahead of time. I was learning how to fly this drone during this trip, and some of the herky-jerkiness of it shows. But the drone I did not purchase myself, and I wanted to bring it home. But I did get a little more confident as things wore on. But this big berg is probably aground. If you see the white line, it's the current moving around it. It's probably aground in about 500 or 600 feet of water. So whatever you're seeing there, it goes, way down. And when we approached the coast of Greenland, we started to see ice because there's a shelf there, like a continental shelf about 300 feet deep. And we started to see icebergs because they had grounded out on the shelf. And they didn't move on until they had melted enough that they could be free of the bottom. And then we tried to get as close as we could to this glacier. Pretty accessible one as far as glaciers are concerned. In that photo there, we're still about 5 miles from that glacier face. And using sextants, we could figure out how tall it was, 1,000-foot face on that glacier. And we're at the edge of where the pack ice started. And I tried to fly the drone up over the top so I could see what the other side looked like. But when it got 3 miles away from the ship, it lost signal and turned around and came back. Which is what happens right there. So this ice field is just pack ice. It's all sloughing off of that glacier. It's all packed tight. You could go through this in the ship, but you wouldn't dare because you might, if the wind turns the wrong direction, you get stuck in there, especially with the big ones moving around. And we did, from this point, went over, anchored a couple miles away. The next morning, one of the dangers up there is katabatic winds, which are basically cold air masses that fall off the top of a mountain. And so where we had anchored the following morning, that happened, and we had, went from 5 knots of wind to 45 knots of wind in about 15 minutes. But what that did do was it blew all this ice right out of the fjord, and we left, and it was clear as could be. And the water here, you can't see it in this picture or video, but the water there is this beautiful glacial blue. And it's so There's so much fresh water in it. I took a bucket and I dipped off of the top, and you could actually drink it. It was slightly salty, but barely. And the last time I did this, somebody asked me what was one of the most surprising things about being up there, and it was the sound of the ice. So this ice, this glacier ice, has been compressed for hundreds, thousands of years, who knows? And when it breaks up like this, it sounds like pop rocks. It's basically effervescent in the water, and as it's melting, it's this constant popping of the ice, letting out the gas. So our goal, one of our goals, was to get to 70 north. We were running short on time because this was a student trip and the kids had to be home at a certain date. We only had time to get just to 70 north, 70 and a very little bit of change. We basically dipped up, hit that, and came back. But 70 north is a lot further north than most people have been. But that wasn't the end of it. There was plenty more to see. The trick for getting home really was fuel and wind. And so getting there, you have all the time in the world. Getting back when that end date is staring you in the face and the wind is blowing in your face every day and you only have so much fuel, things start to get a little tight. But on the way back, still plenty of ice. And what strikes me here is how massive these icebergs are. And you can't get an idea of scale from any of these photos. That iceberg's probably 2 miles away. Some of these things were as big as a mall, not a mini mall, like a proper mall. They'd be, 3/4 of a mile on one face and then 3 miles on another face and 600 feet high, just floating around. It was phenomenal. We pulled into Godhavn, which was one of our last stops and probably one of the best harbors we could find. And when I say that we could find, one of the problems with this trip was trying to anchor. So you couldn't find a spot that was shallow enough that the anchor would hit bottom and far enough away from shore that the ship wouldn't hit the shore. And the only harbor that we found that was similar to one you would find here was Godhavn, which is good harbor in Danish, if anyone speaks Danish. And we came in, we were met with the Dannebrog, which is the Danish royal yacht. So it turns out, coinciding with our visit, the royal family of Denmark was there touring the kingdom. So the queen had abdicated to her son the previous January, and they were out in the yacht visiting the people of Greenland. So we got to meet them. We were in a very small town, a town of maybe 300, 400 people, and then this crew running around. And there was no security detail to speak of. There was none of that. They were just out there in athletic wear, hanging out with the people, which was pretty cool. Looked nothing like this. But this boat's amazing to look at, and she's apparently the only Danish, if you want to call her, Danish naval vessel that survived the German invasion in World War II. So questions I get a lot, what was the food like? It was a lot like this. So if anyone's an aspiring tall ship sailor, a bit of advice, make friends with the cook, and then try to be the one that the cook goes to take shopping, because it's always fun. You get to see all the cool stuff in the new place. Sometimes you get to go to a bar and have a drink, but you also get a say in the snacks and the food that you're going to eat. In our case, the cook had sort of been through this before, had been on the ship the previous year, gone to Labrador, knew that there weren't a lot of store options, and so bought a lot of the proteins that we had and froze them ahead of time. We were taking that out of the freezer as we went. But green stuff we had to go find, and snacks and bread and that kind of thing. And this is a pretty typical look at a grocery store in Greenland. And I think it depends on the day that the boat comes in. I think a container shows up once a week to stock the market. People probably see the ship come in and they know it's the day to go to the market. On day 5 or 6, there's pretty much nothing left. And I don't believe I had a leafy green for a month when I was up there, and it was the first thing I had when I came back was a salad. But apropos of that, there's not that much to eat, and they do hunt and eat whale still. They also hunt and eat seal, things like that. I said before there was a language barrier. Google Translate has not sorted out Greenlandic yet. That's pretty low on their list of things to do, it would seem. So you'd be in the market trying to figure out what you were getting, and you get things like this. You'll be battered. It's sort of like a Creole Danish that they speak. Part native, part Danish is the Greenlandic language. We did see plenty of wildlife, not as much as I would have hoped. This was my learning curve with the drone. I didn't get enough still video of this, but these are capelin. So when we were there, it was capelin spawning season. At the head of every fjord, there were just thousands of these, dead and alive. But you could walk into the water and scoop them out with your hand. And they look like smelts, if anyone knows what a smelt looks like. They also taste like them. They're delicious. But in some of the harbors, the local people would be up there with nets, just netting them out of the water to eat and freeze for the winter. Other wildlife that we saw, we've got sled dogs. I threw a sea turtle in there because we did see sea turtles actually down, not in Greenland, but down off of the coast of Newfoundland, which I would not have thought you'd see a leatherback turtle off of Newfoundland, but we saw like 3 or 4 of them. The occasional whale, but again, a lot of the marine mammals you did not see because a lot of them are food. So these guys are out seal hunting. Almost everybody's got a little boat like this, usually with a couple of rifles, and it's open season all year round on seals. Now, I think they get a bit of a reprieve in the winter because it's hard to hunt seals when it's dark all the time. But in the summer, this is Greenland Day, is June 21st, and the contest on Greenland Day is to go out and see who can shoot the first seal and bring it back. And the winner, I don't know what the winner gets. But every place we went, you saw a bowhead whale was the arch that you went through when you came off the town dock. And those were pretty much everywhere. So very few whales did we see, very few seals. And as far as land mammals, really not much at all. I know. I was, again, like the Northern Lights, I was hoping to see these things. But unfortunately, I didn't. So the polar bears, they all move north, and as ice recedes, they head north with it. So we didn't see any of those. Every town had a bear alarm, basically, a bear siren. So if a polar bear wandered into town, the siren would go off and everyone would know to skedaddle. And the walrus, I guess, hang out in the southern part of Greenland, which I also didn't know. So south of where we were is apparently where you go to see walrus. But there was fishing aplenty, and so I've been a student, because of what I do, of the fisheries for years, the cod fisheries, the banks fisheries, things like that. I've always wondered what it would have been like in the 1800s to go out to the Grand Banks and actually fish and, drop a hook down, pull a fish up. And I think Greenland is probably as close to that as you can get. When the conditions were right and the bottom was achievable, and I say that most of the places we was 1,500, 2,000 feet deep, you can't fish in that kind of depth. These I was catching in 60 feet of water at the anchor in the middle of the harbor. And you drop a jig down, 1, 2, fish on, comes up. You pass the rod around because it's fun and everybody gets to catch a fish. And we had a couple of pescatarians on board, and they were psyched whenever we got to go fishing. I'm holding a codfish, if no one's seen one of those. The fish on the right are wolffish. If anyone's ever heard of a wolffish, they're pretty nasty. They're pretty much endangered down here. I don't know if any of these draggers, even in New Bedford, can bring them back. But I've never jigged one up. I jigged up, 3 in about 10 minutes out there. And you don't hook them in the mouth, so they have a mouth like a dog. They have these big canine teeth, and they eat clams and crabs and things, and they crush them up in their mouth. And their palate is like a hard bone. So when you hook them, you don't hook the mouth. You hook the belly or something when they're swimming around your hook. But they are tasty. So, time to leave Greenland. It was a 12-day voyage across the Davis Strait, headed south into the prevailing southerly winds. Saw our last major iceberg, and then our first sunset again after a month, thereabouts. And we pulled into our only stop on the way home was Battle Harbor, Labrador. Now, this place is accessible to all y'all, so if you don't mind a car ride, you can head up through New Brunswick into Labrador, go to a place called St. Mary's, and take a boat over to this place called Battle Harbor. It's actually a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and several of these buildings you can actually rent out. So you can go out there for a weekend, obviously in the summer. It's a beautiful place. It's a little island. There's not a lot to do. There's a trail around the island, but it's a very cool place to be. It's significant for the Bowdoin because when Perry reached the pole, it was his first stop on the way home, and it had a Marconi station. He was able to radio back to the world that he'd reached the pole, and then he sat there for 2 weeks waiting for the press to come to him because he can't really get there. But he held a press conference in one of these buildings. Nowadays, these buildings are all museum. The whole place is a museum. The doors never close because there's no one on the island. You can't get there. There's no threat of anyone stealing anything. But it had been a fishing outpost for seals, whales, salmon, trout, you name it. They fished it there. In this harbor, which they call a tickle, up there, they have photos of it with 100 fishing schooners in it, chock-a-block back in the day. And this town was a seasonal town, but there were easily 4 times as many houses there at the heyday as there are today. But all these buildings are all museum related to the fisheries that were there. It's very well maintained. This main building is a kind of a restaurant sort of thing, and you can stay in any of these old boarding houses. So that's a 10-10 recommend from me on that. Finally, I brought like a pair of sandals and 3 pairs of shorts, thinking that when I got back to Maine, it was going to be late July and sunny and warm. And this was the first day I think I wore them. When I got back to Maine, we were in Maine for 3-4 days before we went back to Castine. We got some favorable weather coming back and actually made some tracks, and got there a little bit ahead of time. But I was still wearing a sweater up in Maine. It was July 30th, I think, and I was sitting there in long pants and a sweater, shaking my head. But we came back to much fanfare, back to Castine. Total mileage here, almost 4,600 nautical miles, which, if you convert that, is essentially sailing from here to San Francisco and back. It's hard to imagine that, but it is that many miles. And it felt like a long time. It was a long time. And I will say this, because I will get this question, 90% of that was under power. I know, unfortunately. But the wind just wasn't there, and it makes sense that the Arctic didn't see that much exploration in the age of sail, because you can't possibly maneuver through those icebergs, A, with no wind, and B, you basically need to force your way through with power, and if you don't have that in the form of wind or a propeller, it's impossible. And the threat, as Franklin found out, of getting stuck is too great when you can't get yourself out of there in time. This is a very rudimentary map that I made of our whole voyage so that people can picture it. But there's that Disco Bay up there where it cuts in to the ice shelf, or the ice cap. And I couldn't believe the ice cap when I saw it, because you have these 5,000-foot mountains, and when you're at the end of the fjord looking at them, there's a line between them. It looks like low cloud, and you think, oh, there's clouds between those mountains. It's actually the ice cap that you're seeing that's up above the height of those peaks. You're just looking inland. And it's pretty amazing now. Again, I was there in June, July, before things looked as dark as they do now. But I took this photo back then just because I thought it was interesting. But it's the sort of thing that is worthy of talking about, I suppose. And that is that I said before World War II, Greenland was pretty closed off to the world. They weren't allowed to trade with anybody but Denmark, with the exception of a few, whalers in the 19th century. And then when the Nazis took over Denmark in World War II, Greenland basically became a protectorate of the United States. And so we kept it free from invasion, sort of looked over it. Seems like we were nice folks, but really we built air bases there, which were used to hop bombers over to Europe. So they'd take off from the United States, they'd head to Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, Greenland, Iceland, down on over to Europe. And then what that did, though, is it opened up the Greenlandic people to the rest of the world, and they sort of got a taste for what else was out there. And then there's been a bit of a push and pull in post-World War II era with Greenland and Denmark, and with the Greenlanders sort of trying to pull away from Denmark. So currently, and this is all probably in the news nowadays, but I had an opportunity to walk for about a half an hour with the aide-de-camp to the king and ask him a bunch of questions about, what is that relationship like? And about half of Greenland's GDP comes in the form of social programs and social safety net from Denmark. Now you're talking about 57,000 people, so it's not that much of a nut for Denmark. And in return, all of the resources from Greenland basically get transshipped through Denmark. So fishing is the biggest export. You see every port you go into, there's a fish processing facility. They're processing, freezing, and sending on back through Denmark. But the Greenlandic people have earned the right or voted for the right of self-determination, which means at any point they can decide not to be part of Denmark anymore, which leaves them as an independent state, but then they would have to figure out military protection, their own government, their own social things. So they're sort of in an in-between phase right now, and I think it'll be interesting to see where that goes. And I believe, oh yeah, that's the end of it. Yeah.
Hi, Captain. Fred Douglas here.
Hey.
I noticed there was about a 30 or a 40-foot boat when you were in that ice field, and that was someone visiting you, or?
So that was the Arctic Earth, which is another sailboat. We did encounter half a dozen other cruisers up there, and people are doing that. One of them was actually doing the Northwest Passage. So they had just, they were on their way, I think they just come through the Northwest Passage, and we saw them in Godhavn. There was one young woman who was up there on like a Cal 28 or something, and she had wintered over next to that glacier I showed you. She spent the winter out there. Yeah, I know, it's like, there's your next speaker right there. Let's see if I can find out who that woman was. I bet it's a long, terrible winter.
I was lucky enough to go to Greenland many years ago, and the biggest problem there was alcohol. Is that still the case?
Yes, it is, but they have tried to tax it out of existence. So a fifth, and I was just academically looking, of course, a fifth of gin up there is like $95. A 12-pack of beer was probably $20. And again, you figure it's coming in, it's got to be shipped all over the place to get there. But with a winter like that, yes, alcoholism is a problem. And I did ask again, it's a sensitive thing to ask. There were a few people that I was able to talk to, and one of whom, there were a couple of college students up there, and they said that that's a problem. Child abuse is a problem, and well, suicide.
On the vessel I was on, only 2 people could communicate. One spoke Danish, and the other was fluent in ASL, because the fetal alcohol syndrome meant there was a lot of deafness.
Yeah. Anybody else? Oh, I got one coming up. Oh.
Hey, I was wondering if it was tough to try and find places to fuel up in smaller places, or were you able to get enough fuel in bigger population centers to hold you over?
It was not hard to find. And the reason being, so we visited 5 places. We probably visited 5 of the 8, population centers you could go to. But each one of them, when you come in, has big oil tanks, and that's because that's how they're heating. There's no wood to burn. Electricity is coming through the form of generators and such. Geothermal, you would think would be a thing, but I don't think they've gotten there yet. So diesel was actually easy to find, and also the only way to get from one place to another is by water. So without diesel to run the ships, they're basically not moving around.
So when are you going to Antarctica?
There's a ship called the Europa that sails during our winter and their summer down there, and I've been thinking of reaching out, put it that way. But their images look just like this. I saw something the other day. Someone was aloft and looking down to deck, and there was snow on the upper rigging and snow on the deck, and they were in the icebergs down in Antarctica. But I want to see penguins. I think penguins would be a cool thing to see.
Did you know Ernestina's looking for a mate?
I'll pass the word. Oh, okay. Hi, guys. I'll see you after.
Hi.
Oh.
Do you have any idea what percentage of the population of Greenland is native and what group they are?
Okay, so that's a complicated question, and it depends on what you want to call native. And so this was one of the questions that I asked that aide-de-camp, whose name I wish I could remember, but I can't. He basically said that the difficulty, the native Greenlanders want their country back, basically, and there's this movement of taking the country back. But the difficulty is trying to find a true, pure blood native Greenlander is almost impossible, and it's because initially Greenland was settled from the north and from the west, and then the Vikings came in, and then they all kind of died off in about the 1500s with some harsh winters and such. And then, new native peoples moved in, but they've so interbred with the Danish folks that it's, to find a true lineage of Greenland blood, I don't think exists. At least that's what he was telling me, and so it gets a little difficult when they're talking about separation and drawing a line somewhere.
Did you get as far north as you had planned, and did you have any desire to go further once you got there?
I had the desire to go further, and our plan, so 70 north, another 20 miles up the coast is a little stone cairn that a previous Bowdoin crew had built, and our plan was to get that far. But for anyone who knows the sea, when you get to a certain point and you're faced with a forecast and all of these things that are against you, prudence takes over and you head for home. But yes, I had hoped to go further. However, you guys should listen to this. It was decidedly uncomfortable, and I say the voyage itself. And the daily temperature fluctuated from 39 to 41 degrees, and when you're on a ship like that, you're on watch 8 hours a day, you're off for the other, how was that, 16? And in your off time, typically, when I've been working on these boats, you're sailing in New England in the summer, or you're sailing in the Caribbean in the winter, it's nice to be on deck. Here, as soon as you're off watch, you're not on that deck, because it is, even on the sunny days, which were few, it's not that great to be up there in that cold weather, and you just want to go warm up in your bunk. And so by the time 6 weeks in, 5-6 weeks in of being cold and miserable, you're looking you're looking at summer in New England thinking, it's not so bad.
How long did it take Perry?
What's that?
How long did it take Perry to do that?
Oh, I don't know. That's in the...
So Peary, to finance his various expeditions, took a lot of skeletons, stole the meteorites that were the sole source of iron for the locals, and did all kinds of things just to finance, because he was crazy to go to the pole. Is there movement by Greenlanders to get some of that stuff back? Particularly at Bowdoin, there's quite a bit of artifacts, and New York museums have that.
Yeah, I haven't been read in on that, so I can't really speak to it. They do have, I will say this, and I do hope they do get it back. In Nook, in particular, but in all of these places, they have really nice, modern, state-funded museums that pay homage to the native history of Greenland. And in any of these places we went, there was a very well. Not like a backwoods kind of museum, like fully modernized that did tell that history. So I don't know if they're working to get those things back, but I hope that they do.
We are right at that time. If you want to enjoy a little social time with Graham, we invite you to come to the reception out here at the Jacobs Family Gallery and continue to ask questions. Graham does have a book for sale, and he's happy to sign it. Thank you very much. Round of applause for Graham, please. Thank you.